Sure. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Andrew Weiss. I'm Vice President for Studies here at the Carnegie Endowment, and this is such a great thrill to be on a dais with two wonderful colleagues, David Hoffman, longtime Washington Post editor and author of extraordinary books, including The $1 Billion Spy, which I hope all the folks who are here today and who are watching this have read. But David's book had real remarkable access to CIA operational material and was just a truly unique espionage tale among the other things David has written. And then our special guest, Shaun Walker, a longtime foreign correspondent for The Guardian, who is the author of what is now the authoritative history of Russia's deep cover operatives program, the Illegals. And Shaun, I'll just, before I hand this over to David, this is his second book. I would highly recommend everyone The Long Hangover, which came out in 2018, which is a really gritty and very compelling picture of what life's really been like for people in the Putin era, and really captures the way people have become disillusioned and dissatisfied over the course of Putin's tenure. Before I turn this over to David and Shaun, I did want to just put my one little question out there, which is, we're going to talk about these really intense Russian investments in time and energy to place people under fake identities in foreign countries and then conduct their espionage operations. And I dug up last night this wonderful FBI press release when they rolled up a series of 10 Russian illegals who were in the US. And I love this part in the FBI's announcement, which says, we had them under surveillance for a decade. So like, you know, their living rooms and their kitchen tables were bugged and they never noticed. So I'm just really looking forward to hearing how these super spies managed to, you know, all be arrested, you know, over the series of the last couple decades, and what that tells us today about Russia's power on the world stage and priorities. Welcome, both of you. Oh, and then I should mention, I'm sorry, before I hand this totally over, there will be book signing and a reception for Shaun immediately after this event. So I really hope everyone will stick around and cheer Shaun and David on. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Great to be here at Carnegie despite the weather. With my friend Shaun, I wanted just to say a couple quick things. Then we'll have a conversation that I hope will go about 30 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to your questions for 30 minutes, maybe even a little bit longer. But I want to say I can honestly tell you that I was at the early stages of this book when Shaun and I had a couple of coffees in Washington, D.C. to talk about it. And it gives me a great deal of pleasure to read it and see that it matured into such a fine piece of work. I can tell you from my own experience that writing a book about intelligence is often really hard because there's a lot of secrets. Writing a nonfiction book about intelligence is really hard because it's hard to get those secrets out and to find the holes and missing information. And then to write a book about Russian secret intelligence, especially at this time, it's monumental. And Shaun has just handled this like a pro, cut through it like butter, to use a few more cliches. It's really a terrific read. It's deeply, meticulously researched. I think it's fair and it's illuminating. And I'm gonna try to help bring out some of this in the next hour, but please, we'll allow a lot of time for your questions. So Shaun, I guess I'd like to start off by saying congratulations and then asking you to tell us, why did you do this book? Why did you take on such a really hard thing? And tell us a little bit about the inspiration and the process.
Sure. Well, first of all, yeah, thank you for such kind words. Thank you, Andrew, for the invitation, and thanks everyone for coming to listen. Yeah, it's been a bit of an odyssey, this book. It started off in 2016 when I managed to persuade the two sons of a couple of illegals that were arrested in 2010, the arrest that Andrew was alluding to. And they'd been 16 and 20 at the time of the arrest. They were both born in Canada, naturalized Americans. They thought of themselves as Canadian Americans. And the FBI comes knocking, and it basically turns out their parents were, from Siberia, deep cover KGB spies who'd been in the field since before, well, SVR spies now, but had been in the field since the 1980s when they were KGB spies. So talking to these two, no longer kids, young men, got me interested in the psychological side of this kind of almost impossible to calibrate story of how this could happen and what it would be like to find this out about your family when you're 16 or 20. And at that time, I didn't know much about the illegals program. I'd known, 2010, I was in Moscow then. We sort of chased these people around a bit, looking for Anna Chapman and the others who'd been deported in 2010, but I didn't know much of the history, and I started reading it. And it took me a while before I decided there was enough to do a book on it, but through a kind of mix of all kinds of different sources, interviews, archives, and so on. But the thing that really caught me about it, as well as the psychological side, was that just managing to trace this program back a whole century and feeling like kind of at every stage of the way, it was a really interesting reflection of where Russia was or the Soviet Union was at that time, its priorities, its relations with the West. So what I was kind of trying to do was like tell a bunch of cool spy stories, but also have a shadow history of Russia for over the last 100 years.
Shaun, there's a former CIA fellow who wrote a book, and he opened the book by saying, when you strip away all the claptrap of espionage, all the spying, all the things you see on television and public culture, what really matters is the cause for which the spy represents. And you quote George Blake in here saying a very similar thing about the Russian side too. What really matters is the cause. And I wonder, can you tell us, these people who go out into the world undercover for 10 years, disappear, change their personality, were they believers in the cause of Soviet communism? And did they actually do this for feeling that they were changing the world, or were they just sort of functionaries?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think I think we'll talk. I'm sure we'll talk in more detail about the different periods of the program, but I think the changes depending on the time. So, the first illegals in the 1920s, the 1930s, these are really passionate communists. Many of them have a background in the communist underground. They're used to working in disguise. They're really passionate about the cause. And then later, during the Cold War, it's a bit of a different situation. Of course, these are not people who already speak 6 languages and are used to living in the world. They're plucking Soviet teenagers who seem to be smart and promising at languages and putting them through this program. And for them, I think the motivation is pretty clear. It's probably one of the few definitely one of the few ways you can see the world as a young, intelligent Soviet citizen. And then when they're abroad, the interesting thing about illegals is they don't actually see much of life in the Soviet Union, because they're plucked out of university, they're trained in these very, very isolated konzkvartiere, like safe houses basically, and dotted across Moscow. They're not allowed to go out and socialize and have normal lives there. So they don't see much of the life around them. And then they go abroad, and they do see all of the obvious flaws in the West. And so it actually becomes I find it becomes quite easy for them to remain committed. What's interesting to me is, what's harder for me to explain is why clever 22-year-old Russian today, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, would be motivated to do this. And I think we had a partial answer to that. There was a recent New York Times piece about young, early career illegals being caught in Brazil, and there was some leaked communications between them where they're basically saying, what the hell did we sign up to this for? This is a disaster, this life. And I think, now there's an interesting question about post-2022, those opportunities are narrower again, but 10 years ago, if you're a very clever Russian who speaks several languages, you have loads of possibilities, different possibilities than you would have done in the Soviet era. So I think trying to understand what the motivation is now is a bit trickier, but certainly for most of the program, people were committed. And I think just finally, the comparison with the CIA. situation. I mean, I think part of I guess the point of that Blake quote as well is that, there is this kind of, there is this idea of sacrifice and and I mean, it's partly a mythology, but it also does run through this right from the beginnings of the revolution and the underground, that, this is something that you devote everything to, that it's sort of, certainly in the way that Russia now mythologizes the illegals, it's this ultimate sacrifice. It's giving up your normal life for the cause. And I think that's something that has resonated over the years.
Just quickly, can you help us understand, what does illegals mean? Why are they called illegals? And help us understand that versus the regular spies. Who are they?
Yeah, so I mean, the idea, the term illegal in Russian, nelegalная, doesn't quite mean illegal. It's more like
it's not about law, right?
No, exactly. So it comes out of Lenin and the Bolshevik underground, basically. And during the Tsar, before the revolution, he gives there were certain gentle liberalizations. So Lenin decided that they're going to use those possibilities, and they will have legal operatives. So the legal Bolsheviks will run for the parliament. They will work in trade unions and so on.
Legal meant above ground.
Above ground, using their own name, their own documents. And then you'll have the illegal side, which will be, in disguise, will be doing things clandestinely. So that's and then when the Bolsheviks take over, they kind of transpose this onto their first operatives. I mean, they don't have diplomatic relations with many people, so they can't send diplomats abroad in the traditional way. And what would later the Soviets would call legal spies would be the spies under diplomatic cover. But they do have all of these talented clandestine operatives, and so they send those as illegals.
So illegals are really the deep, deep cover. They're never identified. They want to be concealed forever. They don't go to embassies. They don't hang out at parties.
Exactly, yeah, and most big intelligence services have these, right? So the CIA has NOCs, non-official cover. It's a similar concept. They don't work in the embassy, but the difference being that usually they are American. They're not pretending to be foreigners. Of course, in the Cold War, there was no such thing as a traveling Soviet businessman or consultant, or journalist that you wouldn't, anyone presenting in New York as, hello, I'm a Soviet business person, trade representative, they would immediately be suspected of being a spy because it's a closed society, people can't travel. So they need this extra layer of disguise to pull it off.
I'm just curious on this subject, though. How effectively did the illegals over this century actually remain concealed? We're all taken with the popular culture. The Americans introduced us to illegals in a big way, but also the arrest of Anna Chapman, the whole idea that they were out there. I wonder if I were in headquarters, and is it possible to stay concealed for long periods? Did they succeed at that deep cover, hiding themselves for a long time?
I mean, many of them did. And I mean, on the one hand, in a book like this, you inevitably have some level of failure bias, because the guys who get caught or the women who get caught, there's more out there about them. There's often the counterintelligence assessments, there's the surveillance documents and so on. But I think when you look at a big source I used for the book was the Mitrokhin archive, which was an archivist in the KGB who copied thousands of documents and then took them out to Britain in the early 90s. And so here you actually have the raw stuff. So you have people who nobody ever knew anything about them until he brought his documents out. And yeah, you see that on the whole, it is very difficult to go abroad for years and years and not be caught. Plenty of people manage it, but over the decades, there's endless cases of people either cracking up at this kind of psychological tension. Some become alcoholics. Some go.
So sometimes they crack up themselves, and sometimes they get caught outside.
Yeah, or they get caught, or there's a defector who gives them away. Yeah. But there are, there's one of my favorite characters in the book is a guy called Josif Grigorievich, who was born in Lithuania. He adopts the cover of a Costa Rican, and even though he's never been to Costa Rica, he gets appointed the Costa Rican ambassador to Rome, and he spends like 3 or 4 years in Rome. He's meeting the Pope, he's meeting the Italian president, gets accredited to Yugoslavia. He's actually been ordered to kill Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia, and then at the last minute, Stalin dies, the mission is called off, and he's recalled back to Moscow. And Costa Rica has no idea what on earth happened to their ambassador until 1990, sort of 37 years later, when the archives open and it comes out. So I mean, that's one example of, it is kind of possible, even in this quite high-profile job. The guy was on, newspaper front pages and things, managed to keep it quiet.
Shaun, one of the important questions that this book raises that I wanted to ask you, and I did ask you, but I'll ask you again in front of everybody, is to tell us if illegals really work. In other words, in intelligence, often talk about PI, or positive intelligence, the fruits of spying. This is not the sort of sexy part about operations, but it's actually about the goods. And I wonder, in all this 100 years, maybe you could break it down a little bit, but were the illegals ever really successful at getting Russia and the Soviet Union good intelligence? Did they ever have the access to get close to people, to steal secrets, or were they all real estate agents that did cryptography after dinner?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is probably the key question, isn't it? And I mean, it's a bit more complicated, but my kind of overview answer is that with every passing decade, it got harder and harder to do this. It got harder and harder to create solid cover stories and documents, and to be able to bring these characters to life without detection. And as it got harder and harder, the returns got smaller and smaller. So I mean, in the early period, absolutely, there was positive intelligence. I mean, some of these early illegals that are going out, the one that I focus on in the book is called Dmitry Bistreljotov, who's a super talented guy, kind of speaks multiple languages. He has a cover of a Hungarian count who's fallen on hard times and works for a bank. And he manages to, he gets into the good graces of a British Foreign Office cipher clerk, blackmails him, sleeps with his wife. It's the sort of full package. And he's carrying out folders and folders of secret British diplomatic documents over a period of years. And there are several illegals doing things like that in the 20s, and it is kind of a brilliant response to the Soviet need to understand what's happening in this diplomatic world that they're isolated from, and to use the resources they have when they don't have reliable embassies, diplomats, and so on. But then kind of with each iteration, and there's so many moments in this 100 years where you're like, okay, that was good, but maybe that should be the natural end of this program now. And then it comes back and it comes back. And yes, certainly in the later Cold War, they're not, particularly in the US, for example, much of the idea is that they should be sleepers, they should be there for if there is a hot war, all the diplomats are sent home and suddenly you have these sleeper cells you can activate, and they don't do that much. I mean, one little bit of kind of counterintuitive conclusion that I came to is that, even in the 1980s, I mean, they were only useful because the Soviet Union was so closed. But because it was closed, and there were no Soviet tourists wandering the streets of New York without minders. Even the people in the embassy couldn't walk freely and discuss things with Americans. So if you have an illegal who, after all this intensive training, ends up delivering packages in New York, for example, and you think, well, this is the most absurd use of time and resources to train this person for years to do that. But then they write these reports back, and we know that Andropov, the chairman of the KGB, he religiously read all of the reports from the illegals. He would meet them in his office when they came back for their trips to Moscow. So in some weird way, they were providing the closest thing to a kind of real insight into life in the West that the Soviet elite could get. But it's certainly a pretty roundabout way to do that.
But couldn't they have just sent somebody out on the streets to soak up the mood? I mean, did you really need to have a sleeper agent to tell you about the mood in the United States?
Well, you did if you were a society that didn't let anybody simply go. You know, even the KGB people in the embassy were being watched by the KGB counterintelligence. You know, in the 80s, you have the legal resident in New York having, even the wives of Soviet diplomats were not allowed to enter into any contact with an American. So there just wasn't this casual understanding. You know, when you read the memoirs of Yuri Drozdov, who became the boss of the illegals department, but he was the resident in New York for 4 years. And it seems that in 4 years, you know, he went to the theater once and drove to Niagara Falls, and the rest of the time he was in the embassy, which was kind of a mini version of the Soviet Union. So these people didn't really understand America, didn't see it in the same way.
Right, but is there any sort of great Cold War case? So I realize the Cold War is the second part of this, in which an illegal brought home the bacon, you know, really stole some secrets that were really valuable, made a difference?
So I think, you know, trying to pinpoint the giant piece of intelligence in the way of, you know, the big successes like the U.S. atomic program, which, yeah, there was some tangential and illegal involvement, but yeah, there's no one moment where you're like, wow, if they didn't have the illegals, they wouldn't have managed to do this. What I think is quite telling, and again, feels like this way that I saw it as the kind of reflection of the sort of arc of the Soviet period, is that actually the place they're most useful in the Cold War is inside the Soviet bloc. So they send, when the Prague Spring breaks out in 1968, and the KGB is terrified of, is this going to spiral out of control like Hungary in 1956? And so for the first time, Andropov, who's just been made chairman of the KGB, he comes up with this plan to send in like 15 illegals disguised as Westerners. So they'll go into Prague, they make friends with the people who are the leading lights of the anti-Soviet movement, the journalists and the artists and some of the politicians. And they think this goes brilliantly for them. They send back information, they provide kind of timely stuff that allows the Soviets to arrest people, to crush this uprising. And they're so happy with this that they start to use, there's something called they call it Operation Progress. And this goes on right until 1990, and at some point they start using it also inside the Soviet Union. So illegals will pretend to be from the CIA and they will approach suspected dissidents to check whether or not the dissidents would agree to cooperate with these fake CIA people. So, you know, it's really, I think, telling that you have this thing that was designed in the 20s as this brilliant offensive intelligence operation, and you're using it as a kind of paranoid counterintelligence.
Yeah, I think one time in our discussions, you said that the program had become baroque, and that's how I like to see it. I mean, they kept using it. It was very pretty, and it had all kinds of, you know, decorations, but it's still hard to sort of see its utility.
Yeah, and I mean, as I say, it becomes harder and harder. You have hundreds of people working on the sort of back office of this. So, you know, to look for possible identities, to check if they will be suitable, to check there are no relatives of the dead child you've just found that you want to bring back to life, you know, to facilitate all the communications with Moscow, to spot the people in the universities, to train them for years. I mean, it's just this enormous machine to sustain these people who then they get out and they don't actually do that much. So for me, yeah, whereas the first part, the sort of pre-Second World War, it's really all about exciting spy stuff. In the Cold War period, I was much more interested in the kind of psychological impact of, like, what does it mean to essentially take on a new identity for decades and then to end up in actually not really achieving much by the way of, as you say, positive intelligence.
Yeah. So one of the questions that I think we'd all like to hear from you is, what does this story tell us about Russia today? I mean, what kind of characteristics did Russia show in essentially fielding illegals for a century that might help us understand Putin, might help us understand the war? Are there any sort of big lessons here? about Russia and how it behaves?
I mean, I think what's interesting is that when you look at the sort of post-Soviet arc of this, that again, I mean, Soviet Union collapses in 1991. These people, these illegals out in the field, their instructions stop coming, their money stops coming. Kind of, again, this is another one of these points where you're like, okay, that's obviously the end of this program. Some people, like the couple we mentioned at the beginning in Boston, they stay, but essentially many of them, I come to the conclusion, stayed because they quite like their new identities as a young Canadian family. And why would you go back to chaotic Moscow when you could stay with your kids in this rather nice new life you'd built? And it's only later when Putin comes into office and sort of resurrects the program that they come back in and sort of are all into spying again. I mean, I think the most, I think what I've noticed in the last really 5 or 6 years is that in Russia, they've really promoted this almost a kind of cult of the illegal. So you'll see, monthly documentaries on TV about illegals.
Popular culture.
Yeah, monuments, documentaries, carefully kind of curated books by former KGB authors who are given access to archive files, and all of that, all of the stuff we talk about the psychological toll, about the fact they weren't actually achieving much. That's all carefully kind of avoided. And as Putin himself said, these are our greatest spies. Nobody else has anything like this. Like, they are sacrificing for the motherland, and kind of illegals. So yeah, they've been put in the service of this kind of idea of Russian martyrdom, sacrifice, uniqueness that Putin likes to talk about. And I think that's part of the reason why we see that, yet again, against all the odds, in this time of biometric passports and easy travel, and why on earth do you need to train a Russian to pretend to be an Argentinian for 5 years when you can just have a traveling Russian and do what most other espionage services do. I think that's part of the reason why Russia is still sticking to this program. We still see illegals getting arrested, kind of, as we speak, kind of thing.
And my last question comes off of this, which is, in this world, I think all of us now live in a sort of surveillance world that's different than the one of the past. Certainly China, Russia, and the United States all have heavy kinds of public surveillance and so on. Is it possible to run an illegal program when we live in this kind of digital surveillance world?
I mean, it's very difficult, which is why they keep getting caught, I think. And yeah, I think, obviously intelligence services don't reveal the sources, but all the sort of circumstantial things I've been told about this recent wave of illegals being caught suggests that they've been caught through documents, through anomalies in birth certificates. And when you look at some of these, there's a case of the supposed Argentinian couple in Slovenia who were arrested in 2023, end of 2022. And he was an Argentinian born in Namibia, allegedly. So clearly they had managed to doctor some birth records in Namibia, pull out this, go with this, say, I was the son of Argentinian parents in Namibia, please give me a passport. I mean, it's possible they were out there for 10 years before they were arrested, but it's clearly much, much harder, and just creating a new character is very difficult. And I mean, and certainly I think all intelligence services have had to cope with that, right? You can't there's no such thing as the short-term cover where you just pick up one of your stack of 50 passports and travel the world on it and come back and take another one, because of fingerprints and biometrics and databases.
So I'd like to switch to questions. I just want to remind those online, if you have questions, there's a QR code you can use to submit them, and they'll pop up right here. I've got one here waiting, but before I do, let's take a few from the audience. I can't see very well because there's light, but please raise your hands. I'll try and recognize people. I think there are microphones. Do we have microphones, Nina, or just people should speak up? Well, let's start right here.
There's a microphone at the back. Yeah.
We have it coming.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk. Could you talk a little bit how the Russians prevent abuse on the part of the illegals? I mean, it seems to me if they've sent me to San Francisco and I'm living there with a false identity, it'd be very easy for me to just, I could make up fake sources. I met so-and-so in a bar, he told me this about the local political scene, send information back that I read in the newspapers, and if they try to call me back to Moscow, I'd say, no, thank you, and there's nothing stopping me from staying here because I've got a new American identity, I speak perfect English. How do they prevent, did that happen a lot, and how do they prevent that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that classic thing that probably is, happens in all intelligence services of kind of packaging something that you found in an open source setting as some super top secret intelligence. I mean, when your bosses in Moscow, as I say, have so little access to what's really happening, it's much easier to do that, and that definitely happened. In terms of staying there, I mean, this is one of the things. I was so fascinated by the training program, and I spoke to a few people who'd been through it in the Soviet period. And you usually by the 60s, it was sort of 4 or 5 years of really, really intense one-on-one with different trainers every day. And obviously part of this was because it's really difficult to take on the identity of another nationality. So it was language training, it was reading the school textbooks of the country you were supposed to have gone to school in, all this kind of thing. But I also kind of realized that there was the way people talked about it, there's kind of an element where it seemed more like a cult induction. So, they'd be followed around, then they'd be tested on what they did, and if they got a tiny thing wrong, it would be made clear that they'd been being followed and it would have been spotted. They would have bugs in their apartment. So, I managed to get some training files from the archives in Kiev because some of the illegals were trained in Kiev, and you see that they'd had, without the operative knowing, there's like hundreds of pages of bugged conversations when this guy's parents came to visit him in Kiev, and they wanted to make sure that his cover is that he's working in a scientific institute, and they want to make sure he's not even in a quiet moment whispering to his parents, like, by the way, I've got a really cool job in the KGB and I'm being trained for this amazing program. You just can't do that. And as one of these characters said to me, he had this mantra that, like, you can't lie to the center, you can't lie to the center. And it was kind of drilled into him like something you just kind of, you just repeat and repeat. So I think there was this, exactly because this is a paranoid regime that is very scared about letting anybody travel without oversight, and then they're sending these people out who, by definition, they have to be on a long leash. You can't watch them. You can't have diplomats go to them. So I think there was a real effort to sort of induct them into the program in a way that they wouldn't want to just stay in San Francisco, but indeed, in many cases, the program is kind of littered with, there are, on the one hand, people who go through it all, remain ideologically rigid and go back again, but then also people who, there's one guy who goes out in the mid-50s, and sort of within a week, he's like got drunk, decided he's fallen in love with the guest house owner where he's staying, tells her everything, and she tells him to go to the police to report it, and he does. So sometimes it works, sometimes it didn't. Yeah.
Okay, I see one in the back here.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much for your book and for the comments you made. A few minutes ago, you said that when Putin came into power, he resurrected the program. And I'm wondering if you've seen any continuity between the fall and the falling of the Soviet Union through that period of the 90s in terms of the illegals and in terms of the use of spycraft.
You mean if they were still active during the 90s and that? Yeah.
Yes.
So yes and no. I mean, there does seem to have been some kind of illegals. So when you talk to the people who were out in the 90s, they would, the weekly radio messages, the packages of money, this kind of stuff stopped. So there was just nothing. On the other hand, you do have, I mean, there's this, forgotten the year now, but there's a crazy story of, I think it's 93 or 94, where a couple fly in on British passports to Finland, and they have, you know, cash and some radio equipment in their bag, and they've got British passports, but they don't know that there was an election in Britain like the week previously, and they're arrested and deported to Russia. And, you know, there are these sort of isolated stories where, I mean, this stuff would never have happened in the Soviet period. I think you do have plenty of people like the Boston couple, Andrei and Yelena, the ones who were arrested in 2010, who stay out all of these years. But so, I mean, just to like slightly expand on what I was talking about when it comes to them. So when I interviewed her, and when she's spoken, and you know, she goes on Russian TV shows and talks about all this amazing stuff that they were doing, and her telling of the 90s was, you know, the motherland was in a difficult position, but we wanted to help it, and we knew that one day things would be better, so we kind of stuck it out and we waited until we could be useful again for the motherland. And when I was talking, I tracked down some of the people that Andrei, the husband, Don Heathfield, studied with, and he did an MBA in Paris in 1995. And again, Elena says, oh, we moved to Paris because we thought this is a place we would be useful for Russian intelligence. And one of the students who studied with him had this extraordinary story that that one of the lectures in this MBA was being taught by an economist from Russia who was doing a course on post-Soviet economics. And out of nowhere, their friend Don Heathfield suddenly starts talking to this guy in Russian. And everyone's like, what the hell? Like, Don, you don't know, you never told us you speak Russian? And he's like, oh, yes, it's just like a skill that I have. And then it's never mentioned again. And, you know, for me, this like, so talking in Russian, I mean, this is something an illegal can never do. They can't whisper to each other in bed in Russian in the night. So this is not a party trick that you just whip out at a lecture. So to me, this was this kind of eureka moment of like, these guys were not working for Moscow collecting intelligence, even though actually on this MBA course, there were all kinds of people who would have been fascinating for Russian intelligence. And maybe later he went back to it and he was organizing trips to China for French businessmen. I mean, there was all sorts of interesting things. And he later comes back and goes to Harvard Kennedy School. By that time, maybe he was actively working. But this one story made me realize that actually maybe, you know, he was Don Heathfield, like doing an MBA and looking forward to his life as a Canadian. And there's just one more story on that because it's one of my favorite is the KGB, as well as running its own illegals program and as well as spying on all the Soviet bloc in Operation Progress, it helped the Soviet bloc services run their own illegals program. So the Czechs and the Hungarians and the Poles, with KGB support, ran their own illegals. And in one of these countries, I was told by a source, a kind of retired intelligence guy, that when the country was preparing to enter NATO, they kind of did an audit of all their intelligence operations. And they were like, oh my God, like we have these files of these illegals that we sent out in the 80s, and like no, they never came back. Nobody's been in touch with them. So they sent someone out to track these people down, because like we can't have a spy living in a NATO country when we're joining NATO countries. And they knock on this guy's door, and he basically says, you know, this is my life now, like my family don't know anything, my background, I'm not spying, leave me alone, go away. And they go home and think about it, and they decide, okay, we think this guy's harmless, we'll just leave him to stay there. So there were these, you know, I think the 90s was this time where, of course, some people stayed in, some people decided to go home. Some kind of rump program was gently resurrecting, I think, in the late 90s, but it's only really when Putin comes back, and I think specifically in 2004, there's a kind of real push to, okay, let's really revamp, refund, restart this program, send out new operatives, and then it's kind of an upward trend from there.
I see a few hands, but I got one or two online too, and I want to remind people online, you can ask questions with the QR code. Shaun, do you think that the same amount of research will be able to be conducted in the future with things like archives now are closing down, FOIA is getting harder. Could you do the same book today?
Well, I mean, so I think, yeah, for the Soviet period, I mean, the big thing is the KGB archive. That's fully closed. It's going to be closed. I'd be amazed if it reopens in
But there
my
have been bits
lifetime.
and pieces, right? Mitrokin, Lithuania, some stuff from out the periphery.
Yeah, so Mitrokin is great, but Mitrokin is like, you know, when I got this file from Kiev of a training file, it made me realize how, I mean, Mitrokin's fantastic, but you know, the man could make maybe 4 paragraphs of notes on an illegal, maybe in the most promising case, a page or 2. And the files of the illegal who was trained I got in Kiev, 3,000 pages just of his training. His operational files when he was later sent out, those are all in Moscow, those are closed. So there are files with an extraordinary level of detail. There's a lot of Russian books which are written by, as I said, KGB historians, but many of them actually, you know, there's a lot of interesting stuff that when you read between the lines, you know you're not getting everything, but some of the stuff you're getting is quite useful and interesting.
And some of it's just interesting and not useful.
Yes. And then, but there is also a problem in terms of, you know, data protection with archives in the West. And that, I mean, while I was working on this, half of the Mitrokin archive was closed for GDPR kind of data protection grounds. So suddenly stuff that I'd been working on, you know, I was lucky to have seen most of it, but I couldn't go back and look at it again because it was closed.
Okay, one other from online. Can you tell us how close or far from fiction is the series The Americans?
I think it's, so, you know, The Americans basically takes this family that I've been talking about, Andrei, Elena, Boston, Paris, MBA, and it's 2 kids. It's kind of their story, but they move it back to the 80s, right? And the kind of end game of the Cold War. And yeah, both my observations and actually asking Elena this same question of, because they've watched it. I think
whole thing.
Yeah. I think the psychological aspect of it was pretty well done. I think, you know, the idea that one half of the couple was having more doubts than the other half. I think that's part of the whole reason actually they started sending them out in couples, because they realized that just sending somebody to be in their own personal unit was a recipe to send them mad, and that if there was 2 people, they could kind of support each other. Also, they could, if someone was really losing it, they could drag them back before they defected, this kind of thing. So that, I think that the husband, wife, kids, family dynamics, missing the homeland, all of those things. You know, Yelena has this extraordinary story of like flying to a South American capital to meet a handler, and the handler kind of driving her out into a forest and giving her a bit of Russian black bread and a shot of vodka and some letters from home, which were then burned. And then, you know, she goes back off and she tells her kids like, oh, I was just, you know, on an errand in Canada or something. So like that kind of stuff, I think quite accurate, but the assassinations and the wigs and the disguises, you know, that what you quickly find is that once you get to the Cold War and you get to this counterintelligence environment, particularly in the US, you can't, like, if you've trained someone for 5 years, you're not going to send them out to do a risky, offensive espionage operation wearing a wig where they might get busted. And on the occasions where they do try to do that, people do get caught very quickly. So yeah, I think on that side, they were kind of, the psychology was accurate for the 80s and the operations were maybe more accurate for the 20s or 30s, I would say, with the Americans.
All right, Jacob Weisberg, if you're listening. I see some now in the room, right here in the middle. I see a hand. Can you?
I was wondering.
I think there's a microphone.
I was wondering if the program that you're describing, if they modernized it at all, and if like right now, what's the most, like how big of a threat is it to the U.S., this program, versus any other intelligence methods that the Russians are engaging in?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that by its nature, because the training is so hard and individual and long, like this is always a boutique program, right? It's always I think at the height of the Cold War, there were about 100 KGB illegals that had been trained at any one moment. So I don't think, a few of my friends or people I know who've like read the book and come back to me and be like, oh my God, I knew there was something weird about like my neighbor, but turns out they're an illegal. And I think realistically it's unlikely. It is a really small number of people, and I think there are other aspects of Russian intelligence operations today that are perhaps scarier. But I do think what's so fascinating about this is that and when you talk to the counterintelligence people about this program, there's a sort of this twin reaction, and it's sort of how I end the book, where on the one hand they sort of say this is laughable. I mean, we can't believe they're still doing this in 2025. Like, what a waste of time, ha ha ha. And then they sort of stop and they're like, but you just need one in the wrong place, and then it's really dangerous. And that's why we still have to put all these resources into tracking them. And I mean, you see, just to give you one example, Maria Adela Kufelt Riviera, who was a Peruvian jewelry designer, but actually a GRU illegal, called, I think, Anna Kolobova or Olga Kolobova. She was withdrawn, actually, but later Christo Grozev and these wonderful open source investigators uncovered her because she had a passport number that was quite similar to some other known GRU operatives. So she was living in Naples. She had her jewelry brand. She was the president of the local Lions Club, and she was organizing all of these events for US Navy people, NATO people who are based at the military, the naval base in Naples. So you start to think, well, okay, that's actually interesting and dangerous, and so I think the overall answer is that no, it's not a threat, but then actually it can be still.
I know we have some more hands here, right here. Can we get a microphone up to them? Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. So obviously you mentioned that there were like a few gaffes, like speaking Russian openly at the lecture, but can you speak to the overall quality of Russian tradecraft? Like, were they on par with their Western peers, or were they sort of lagging behind because of a lack of cultural understanding?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's, I'm sorry to keep giving these like A but B answers, but it's kind of the same thing. That, I mean, on the one hand, it clearly takes like an enormous amount of discipline to, Andrei Bezrukov posed as Don Heathfield in Canadian. He had a weird voice, but I mean, he did an MBA with a bunch of other Canadians, and they all thought there was something a bit weird about him, but nobody started to guess what it was. So it's clearly quite impressive that if you could pull that off. But there are also in that 2010 cohort, there's 9 or 10 of them who were arrested in 2010. And the way that the FBI got into their communications was that another couple had left, I think they'd left the floppy disk and the password for how to get into their communication system in their house. So the FBI did a house search, found it, and after that could read everything. And that's the crazy thing with those, as Andrew said at the beginning. I mean, this couple's lying to their kids for 10 years, and the whole time the FBI knows everything about them, and the whole thing has been kind of pointless. So it's a sort of, I think it's a mixed bag. I think you do get, there's been over the years, there are people who are watched by the FBI for years on end, and they don't spot it. But I think it's very hard to spot, and I think, that's, just to mention Christo again, he calls this the hunter being hunted syndrome. Like, if you are in this position and you're sort of snooping into everyone else, you kind of you're just not on guard so much, even though these people have been trained to like detect surveillance, to go out on, do all of these surveillance runs. But when the FBI has found them and kind of knows where they are and is doing this somehow for 10 years, none of these people notice.
Oh, now we got a bunch of them here. Oh, over here.
Thank you. I'm a physicist, so I like numbers, and I wanted to know more about how many people were out there. You said 100 or so at the peak. And where were they located, and how did the Russians decide, okay, we're going to send somebody to Canada and Naples, but not to Belgium? And also, I'm curious whether any of these people were sent into very sensitive operations. We have North Koreans now who are posing as IT workers and working remotely in some very sensitive jobs.
Yeah, so I'll talk about the Soviet period because that's the Cold War period because that's where the best archive data is for the sort of geographical distribution. So they used them everywhere. The US was always the primary target, and quite often people would be sent out for. So Canada was usually a stepping stone. So the idea is you'd go to Canada, you'd build up your cover as a Canadian in a sort of less demanding counterintelligence environment, and then you'd move to the US after you were naturalized or after you got all your documents in order. There was also, sometimes that would happen with South America. One of the people I interviewed, so his cover was an Austrian citizen, and he was in Ireland, he was in Germany a lot, and part of his task was always to look out for Americans. Like, as soon as you meet somebody, do they have relatives who live in America? Do they know about America? Might they be able to be somebody who could be developed that would give you an in that you could later move to America? So there was a focus on America, but illegals were working everywhere. There was some that worked as European business people, and there was a Swiss beauty salon in one of the East African capitals. There was a couple that was running it that were illegals. There was a guy that was a trainer for one of the people I spoke to, who his cover was that he was some kind of European businessman in Pakistan. And there's a really interesting moment. So after the Soviet Union and China have a split, they try to start training Chinese illegals, and they do this with a mixture of Chinese. They try with Chinese emigres, and they try with sort of Central Asians, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, who they think might be able to pass for Chinese. And it's a complete failure with both of them. And there's these stories of how they sort of infiltrate them, and within a couple of weeks, these people are always busted because one had like cigarettes that were only supposed to be given to foreigners, and like local people didn't smoke them. Some of the emigres had like forgotten the new customs of communist China, or didn't know the new customs of communist China. And again, it was much harder. So this works really in an open society where people don't ask too many questions, where you can sort of blend in. If you're trying to infiltrate an illegal into a closed society, that's obviously much harder when there's paperwork and checks, and people are looking out for suspicious aliens all the time. Was that everything? Okay.
Shaun and I have talked about this, that in some ways the Russians and Soviets showed they were better at human source intelligence for a long time, and that the United States, we were sort of getting our feet wet after the war. We had these huge programs which Frank Wisner ran to infiltrate, Ukraine, Albania. They were all disasters. It was very hard for us to get people into a closed society. It was much easier in the Cold War to get their sleepers into our society, and I think that's always been a dichotomy.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Just quickly on that, I mean, there's something, I hope somebody writes a book about it someday, but there are these amazing CIA documents of this program in the early 50s, alongside all those ones you mentioned, where they go to the refugee camps in Germany, they look for Russians who are emigres or prisoners of war.
Austria.
And they train about 12 of these people up, parachute them into the Soviet Union as kind of illegals, essentially, and the idea is that they'll be sending back information. And again, they pretty much all of them get caught.
It was a big disaster. Yeah. We got 5 more minutes. Let's see what else. I got another question here. Yeah.
Thank you. You mentioned that with information technology, it's very difficult now to have this kind of deep cover or recycling of one's persona, a reinvention of a persona. And yet we've seen several cases that could be arguably called illegals from the PRC operating for long periods of time on the West Coast and the East Coast. And it's not clear that there's some systematic program in the PRC generating these kinds of performers. But I'm wondering, when you look at the news, do you, given your experience, and Dave, question for you, David, also, do you sense that there is some kind of long-term extensive illegals program being generated in the PRC?
I'll tell you my answer, absolutely. And I think that if you look just at the transnational repression and the machinery that China created to carry that out, police stations all over the world, hidden police stations, I'm sure they have their residenturas and their illegals all over the place. And it's probably been easier because there's a big Chinese diaspora to, for them to fit in. I think it's an untold story completely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a specialist on China, but what I think the thing with the biometric passports and the databases and so on is that in some ways it's actually a long-term illegal is easier to create than kind of rotating short-term covers. So if you're able to bring a character to life and you have the passport and you get your first fingerprints and you haven't previously traveled abroad with those fingerprints under it, and that is then your identity, that's something that I think you can do, but what you can't do is this sort of switching and changing and picking up a new passport each week.
And also, we've seen a lot of examples, I'm not saying anything secret here, that the Chinese Ministry of State Security approaches people abroad, just civilians about their lives who are in sensitive positions, and tries to pressure them into working for them. And there are threats against their family back home. So in some ways, their model could be a little bit different. Okay, do I have any more questions out there? Oh, here's one. Okay, please.
I think Andrew has one as well.
I'm sorry?
So I'm curious,
Last, okay.
you talk about how they're indoctrinated during their training to believe in their mother country. And so even though I could see perhaps being away from their native country and culture for a long time, they still have an affinity for it. What about language? If they're never using their Russian, do they forget how to speak Russian?
Nilza. Совершенно nilza.
Well, there's a guy, the longest serving illegal who went back in 2010, his name was Mikhail Vasenkov, and his cover name was Juan Lazaro. He was a Peruvian, Uruguayan photographer. He'd been sent out in 1976, so he was, 34 years. He was living in New York. He'd retired already, and he'd actually asked, as a favor, he was allowed to remain in New York. He had a Peruvian wife, and the only operational thing he'd do is once a year he'd pick up some money from a handler, basically a pension. And he was caught, rounded up, sent back in 2010. And indeed, he could remember Russian, but when you heard him speak, it was crazy Russian with a really strong Hispanic accent. Apparently he didn't like speaking it. He wasn't happy to be back in Russia, even though for all those years he'd apparently been this kind of dedicated operative. So yeah, absolutely. I think people do forget their languages. And I mean, I spent some time with a couple who were posted abroad under German-speaking cover, and I mean, when they argue, they still argue in German.
Okay, Andrew, you want to close this up?
I just got one question. Thanks both of you, Shaun and David, for doing this. I just wanted to ask you about Putin and the illegals program and the way we've all seen Putin play ice hockey at night against, the greats from the NHL. He's now saying he was part of this program himself. And I'm just sort of curious what that tells you about Putin. Is he a wannabe? Is he, what gives in terms of his desire to, embrace these people so publicly and to be in every photo op? Thanks.
Yeah, so Putin's time in Dresden is this kind of, people have come up with all sorts of different theories about it. Some people suggest that actually he was much more important than we knew, and he was running all these agents and so on. I don't tend to subscribe to that. I think there's a book by someone who served at the same time in Dresden, which is obviously long out of print now, but who basically portrays what Putin was doing as the really boring very early stages of illegal selection. So kind of looking for who might be suitable. And I think this guy even writes that, like, you know, he had no illusions that his candidates would even make it to the final line, but it was the very first stage. But yeah, he has indeed. He suddenly came out sort of 6 or 7 years ago and said, my whole career in the KGB was to do with illegals. And yeah, he suddenly pops up at the SVR headquarters giving these speeches. He's, as I said, kind of continually saying that they're these unique things to Russia, which in a way is true. But again, like really bringing this kind of mythology that nice, you know, carefully smooths away anything that kind of doesn't fit into that heroic narrative.
I think that he was running a disguise operation. I mean, I think he was preparing illegals in Dresden to go to the West. He was helping them with making sure that the labels in their coats were proper, you know, that they had the right thing in their briefcase. He was doing logistics. And I wrote a big article about that and went to the Stasi archives and looked it up, and that's what I found there. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Please buy a book. Congratulations. And you'll be able to talk to Shaun afterwards as well, if you have illegal questions.
Thank you.
Reports of anybody trying.
Tying together evidence of a comprehensive